and welcome to a new episode of League of DFS. My name is Chris Chung. You can find me on Twitter at primetime. Tonight I am joined by a member from the Clutch Gaming community, one who is also a host of a podcast called League Leaders Pod, Zachery Lindsey. Zach, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that the League of Legends scene is still fairly new, but it's growing in popularity, especially in North America. And for you guys, how did it start for you, and how did it grow from just being a viewer to someone who plays to now someone who is part of a podcast to talk about a team like Clutch Gaming?
Well, I've actually been playing League for a really long time, and I don't think I've gotten that much better at it. I've been playing. The first champion that I actually bought was Leona,
Oh, wow.
and she was brand new at the time. So I'm a bit of an old guy in terms of League. And then I've been watching since I graduated college in 2014. That I was looking for jobs, but I also had Twitch open at the time, and that's when I started seeing a whole bunch of streams and stuff like that. And I actually caught up with Europe, the EU LCS at the time. And so I followed them, and then I realized, wait a second, there's a North American scene too. And so then I started watching that as well. But what really got it is that I had an argument with my dad, actually. He's on the radio down in Houston, Texas, and he got mad because one weekend I was like, I can't go out and do anything. I gotta watch the LCS that's on. And he's like, why on earth would you watch people play video games when you could play video games yourself? And I'm like, well, Dad, you watch people play football, you watch people play basketball, and you could go out and play those sports too. And that kind of sparked a good conversation between us. And when Clutch Gaming got involved, my dad knows a few people at the Houston Rockets, and he's like, this is something we can talk about. I'm already trying to figure out what you're doing and how this game works. So let's make a podcast about it. Let's start having our conversations recorded and put it out in the world. And so we practiced kind of behind closed doors all spring until playoffs. And then when Clutch actually made it into playoffs, we were like, this is our moment. This is when we're going to release. And so then we got to follow that great run, the upset against TSM, and then unfortunately falling down to fourth after that. But yeah, since then we've just been reporting pretty much everything that is going on with at least North America, but mostly with Clutch.
That's awesome, man. And you got your dad involved. And I remember that story because I read an article about it, how you guys got started. And I want to link people to that, just knowing that as far as fandom goes, there's really not too big of a difference between a fan of a sports team, a traditional sports team, versus a fan of an esports team. And I've come to enjoy that myself. So it's very cool to have your dad to be part of it.
Yeah, no, it's been great. He likes to say I'm the brains of the operation, but he's the one who makes it sound good. So we're a really good tag team.
I'm sure it really helped when I'm guessing Houston Rockets is his favorite basketball team, NBA team.
Well, he's a little bit biased since he does work in Houston. They're his hometown team.
Got it.
If there was a team that was actually from Kentucky, where we grew up, then I'm sure that would probably be his favorite. But there's nobody down there. So,
oh man. But still, it's awesome now that both of you can connect on this, and him being part of the pod as well. It's just fun to listen to you guys talk. Now let's dive in a little bit into the LCS. Looking back this whole year, Clutch, this is their first year, and they drew some of the names such as Febifin, Apollo, some of the great players from other teams, and they started the franchise this year. If you look back in 2018, how would you sort of grade the team from your perspective?
I'd give it a solid A-. I think some of the greatness that you saw in spring was that they really fit into that meta where it was very bot lane and mid lane centric. So you could leave Solo on an island and he would lose as gracefully as possible or give up pressure as gracefully as possible. And then with the chaotic meta that's come in summer, you can really see that they were struggling to find an identity for a while. And now that it's swinging back around towards marksman again, it's doing much better for them, although they still still have quite a few issues to work through. But overall, I would definitely give them an A- because they came out of the gates pretty strong.
Absolutely. It was a very surprising team to follow, because partly because we don't know much about them. They're not the traditional powerhouses like TSM or CLG, but they made it pretty far into the playoffs. Were they the ones that pushed Team Liquid all the way to Game 5?
They pushed 100 Thieves to Game 5,
Thieves.
yeah.
Right, 100 Thieves, that's right.
And that was by far the closest game of the playoffs, in my opinion, was Game 5. That took absolutely forever. And it's really funny. We were talking about our podcast way back when. There were a couple of shockwaves that missed by a pixel off of Cody-san. Whereas if that had hit, the entire series would have changed around. And it's great to have those really tight games. Unfortunately, we lost, but it was really, really great games to see.
It was definitely a very close game, and I was very excited about it. I felt that if they had 2 more rounds, Clutch could have pulled out a win against 100. And you're right, it was that close. It was a pixel hit, or maybe some one small movement, but definitely entertaining, and there's a lot of promises to show for them. So, taking a step back, when we look at the whole North American LCS, what have you been most impressed by this whole season?
I have been very, very impressed with 100 Thieves, actually. They're another team that just kind of came out of nowhere and put a whole bunch of names together. And even though they lost Meteos in the middle of this split, they've done very, very well for themselves. It's really funny that they lost 3-0 in the finals, but I don't think that's indicative of how good of a team they really are. I'm not saying if I had to do it over, I'd be a 100 Thieves podcaster, but the thought has crossed my mind at times. They are very, very impressive, and I'm really glad that they're still doing pretty well.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. It's been sort of an unknown as well, along with Clutch coming into the season, but they had names such as Afro Move behind them. So at first, during the spring, I have to say I wasn't too impressed, but that's because I don't know Afro Move before this past year. But it seems like the team is gelling together. Making transition in the middle of a split is weird to me, because it's not someone that they brought in during the break between spring and summer, but someone who they decided to bring in or trade away Meteos before Rift Rivals. Yeah, before Rift Rivals.
Yeah, just before.
And now they are in contention again in the playoffs, and I think they're fighting for first place right now.
Yeah, I think they're just one game back from first. But I mean, the top of the standings are really tight, so I think they're locked for playoffs as far as I can tell. I don't think there's a way that they drop all the way down to 7th. But I think them and Liquid are the only 2 that are actually safe. I know Liquid for sure is safe, but I think 100 Thieves is pretty solid behind them.
Yeah, I think they could have been tied for first if not for playing around with, I think it was FlyQuest, one of the games. It was like a Nexus Rush.
Everyone thinks they can play around with FlyQuest, and FlyQuest is just like, all right, I'll take your base. So,
and now FlyQuest is in playoffs from
exactly.
Yeah, one of the teams, along with Golden Guardians, which is very surprising to me as well. I don't know what your sense are. What do you think about FlyQuest and Golden Guardians' chances for the summer?
Golden Guardians, they've definitely suffered with the meta shifting back to control mages in the mid lane. You could really see that Mickey shined on some of those unconventional picks, or when he was just playing backup for contracts, a lot like how Jensen and Blabber have been for Cloud9. So you can definitely see that there's struggle when there's more demand on Mickey to play out of his mind, I guess, or above his level. FlyQuest, I have to credit JJ, their support, who came in early on in the split, but not right at the very beginning. And he was on the analyst desk a couple weeks ago, and he had said that the lower tier teams could not get scrims with the higher ranked teams from spring, that they just, it was, I'm guessing like FlyQuest, Optic, and Golden Guardians just could not get scrims with like 100 Thieves or Liquid or TSM, whoever. And so because of that, they came up with their own meta, their own take on the meta after the death of Marksman there for a bit.
Right.
And the results showed. I mean, they absolutely dominated, and now they've taken to just saying, well, no, we can just base race you. So they're definitely a force to be reckoned with, although I still have trouble believing that they're a very consistent team. They just don't have that. I don't know. There's just no X factor for me. They're very weird and they win a lot, but I just can't get a handle on them.
Sort of a feel that it might be a little bit fluky in a sports sense, team that runs hot for a while, but they'll certainly lack that confidence that you have in them, because they do fall behind a lot in games.
Yeah, they do. And they're not, again, because they were a team that came in before franchising, but that version of the team never really had much success outside of the very beginning. When they first joined, and basically had all of Cloud9 minus Sneaky. But like, I just get the sense that they're calling other people's bluff, not so much that they have the best cards to start with in their opening hand. So I don't know. I've been very impressed by Flame and Wild Turtle this past couple weekends, but and Keen has done pretty well too.
Yeah.
But it's just these are players that are historically inconsistent, and I have a lot of trouble putting faith into them.
Absolutely, and I'm there with you. There's a cautious optimism then, because
for sure.
I do think, from what I know about Wild Turtle and Keen, they could have done more in Flame as well. They could be doing more in the spring, especially, but they didn't show it. But now they're showing some fight in them. They're getting into the playoff race, and we'll see how things unfold. Now, before we head into my next topic, I want to have your sense of your prediction of how the summer split playoff will play out. Who will be in? Who will win? What is your thought on this?
So I think that it's heavily favored for Liquid to get to Worlds, pretty much based on championship points is my bet. With them losing to Cloud9 this past weekend, I think Cloud9 has an honest shot at finally becoming a champion again. It could just be that Liquid runs it back and they defeat whoever they're up against 3-0 over and over again. But Liquid has not looked as dominant to me since Rift Rivals, and not Rift Rivals, since MSI. And because of that, I hesitate to say that they're guaranteed to win the split. So I think that it's about time for Cloud9 to actually settle on their roster and make a big run for it here. It's so weird because they had so many struggles at the beginning, but recently they've just been on fire. And I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. Whereas some of the other teams like 100 Thieves and Echo Fox and even Liquid have all had their ups and downs recently. Echo Fox also with the big roster changes, I'm not sure how well their kind of honeymoon phase is going to carry over into playoffs. I'm not sure that team has enough experience as a team together to really make a run. But I definitely think Liquid could make Worlds because they won the spring split and they have so many championship points banked. But I'm actually calling for Cloud9 to win the split.
Wow. That is awesome. Considering, like you mentioned, some of the craziness that went on with Cloud9, starting with benching of the mid and bot laners, and then they've played around with the roster, and now Cloud9 is back in the midst. They've been on the bottom for a while, for a week or so. And now they're suddenly back in the playoff race, and I wouldn't blame people for being excited about their chances of winning Summer Split. So that's exciting to look out for. With that said, now I want to tap into, we spoke a little bit before the show that you had some experience in terms of understanding the process of coaching teams, making picks and bans, and all the theories and metas and things like that. But first, I want to talk to you about the picks and bans, the process of behind the scenes of understanding how coaching influences, or how players choose their composition. Because every week when we watch teams make their picks and bans, we get confused about some of the picks that they make. I know myself and my buddies are always frustrated when teams continually pick Ezreal, even though his win rate is not as high. And for that's one example. So what goes into when a team goes to make their picks and bans? Why do they pick champions that statistically do not seem to be heavily favored? And what is it about that you know about the player and coaches who makes this final shot at or final call for the picks?
It's definitely a conversation throughout picks and bans. I think all the teams come in with a pretty solid plan of what they don't want to come up against. And then they try and pick based off of what they know of a matchup, whether or not something's decent or not decent. When it comes to Ezreal specifically, I have a feeling there's a lot of scrimmage bias, which is something we hear about a lot. So and so is doing really well in scrims, or I guess in this case, Ezreal is doing very well in scrims. But transitioning that to stage is very different. Additionally, I think that this is something that I was talking to a few other people about, is that Ezreal isn't really being properly utilized. They're picking it because his Essence Flux, his E, is used very defensively more often than not. But if you take a look at this past weekend's game with Fnatic, where they actually played Reckless, he was on Ezreal and he was shifting forward. His team was making space so that he could move forward in the team fight and deal as much damage as possible. And that's really the difference between using Ezreal correctly and using it incorrectly. So I understand the North American LCS statistics say Ezreal's not great, but I think there's a lot of other statistics. Korea also is very good at utilizing Ezreal well. So I think there's a lot of scrimmage bias and looking at other regions that goes into that. As far as actually who has the final say on what you pick, it varies from team to team. From what I remember on my time during an amateur league, it was the Discord Community Championship Series. Shout out to those guys. They're great, and they're actually in their second season, so check them out. The way that it worked is that the coach and I would come up with, well, mostly the coach would come up with the best draft possible based on what we knew the opponents would play, and then based on what we could play. And then we tried to make sure that we got our players on as many comfortable champions that worked together as possible. So the coach had a really heavy hand in what was actually being picked. But I do know that on other teams, TSM, for example, has been noticeable in the past for letting their players had a lot of agency in the draft and saying, well, I know that Fizz counters Ari or something like that. And so they can kind of go off of their plan and make that kind of drastic shift for a different pick if they know what's coming. So,
oh yeah, that's very helpful and insightful for us to understand the process that goes on, because we as viewers, we are sitting back in our watching our YouTube channel or watching our Twitch channel, just yelling, "Why are you picking that champion? How does that composition make sense?" More often than not, we can see some of the results, but sometimes players do surprise us with their picks, and even with a pick that seems disadvantaged at first, they pull through. But more often than not, we understand that the game is won or lost from the pick and ban phase. Even then,
I disagree. I don't think it's quite as drastic. I think with how chaotic the meta was at the beginning of the season, you could certainly see the games being more or less won at pick and ban. But recently, it's very heavy on how well you execute. If you take a look, there's a clutch game where they were playing. It's when they had Moon, Piglet, and Vulcan in the roster, and they picked pretty much the same composition twice, and they really failed to execute on it very well. But then you take a look at it. The pick specifically being Trundle, Ezreal, and Tom Kench. Well, this weekend, Clutch picked Trundle, Ezreal, and Braum instead of Tom Kench. So it's kind of that same standard, a couple of tanks and Ezreal to deal damage as their composition. But this time, Clutch was actually able to make it work. They had different picks in mid and top, which certainly made that easier. But that same three core champions were still very comfortable for Clutch, and they were very different based on the execution.
Okay, that's fair. And I'm still learning about all of this, and it's very helpful to have you and people like you be able to break it down for us, because we're very new to this, and it's helpful for us because we as fantasy players really want to know how teams are approaching their picks and bans and how well they execute in certain comps. So that's very insightful. Now, shifting from picks and bans, let's talk a little bit about the meta. It sounds to me that this year, more so than any other year, there's been a dramatic shift. Some of the things that change the whole complexion of the game, where players are needing to do different preparations. We've seen in the European League where Reckless had to sit out because he was not familiar with non-marksman, and his championship pool is severely limited. It worked out for Fnatic, but other teams are also trying different things. What has been your sense of the meta? I know that the meta has affected Clutch Gaming a lot more during the summer when they made that shift. Do you see them reverting back to the old ways? Are you thinking, and how do teams prepare for such big changes?
Honestly, there's not really a way to prepare for a change this drastic. In the past, it's always been a number of changes to support or mid lane, jungle, or top lane. But the one constant in League of Legends up until patch 8.11 is you need to have a marksman in the bottom lane. Mm-hmm. And when 8.11 came around and marksmen were absolutely gutted, it threw everything into chaos and uproar. And you did see, you saw the funnel changes, which were a result of the jungle changes, and I believe it was patch 8.9. Yes. And then 8.8 and 8.10 were dealing with mage itemization and mana regen, and it was very, very disruptive. I can't, I can't, in all honesty, call the meta anything but chaos at the beginning of summer, because none of it made sense to me as somebody who's been playing for so long.
Yeah.
It was way more than I was expecting. I don't think they're ever going to put marksmen back to their, I'm going to call it, overpowered state, because they certainly were a necessity. And I like the fact that now marksmen are viable, but they're not necessary in the bottom lane. Mm-hmm. And I think that Riot likes that too. They want to make more marksmen viable again, mm-hmm. where you have some that just should not exist right now. But I don't see them ever really going back, although they have reverted some things. Rengar and LeBlanc were most recently reverted after a couple of years. They had different abilities based on the assassin reworks that they did. Mm-hmm. And the champions were just incredibly hard to deal with and balance properly. So they put them back to their old states, which is now more balanced because the rest of the game has changed so much. Yeah. There's kind of just a revolving door of what's good right now in League of Legends. So it's really hard to tell how well your team is going to adapt to that based on how things go. So with Clutch, it really hit hard that you couldn't put everything on Apollo's shoulders. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day. You had to have another person willing to step up and deal damage and be a big carry. And Febiven and Solo stepped up as much as they could, but at the same time, you were having very odd strategies with the gold funneling that came around, and with the Heimerdinger that just prevented bot lane from being able to do anything at all. Mm-hmm. And you also saw Lyra just absolutely struggle this summer. Yeah. So it also, because of the jungle changes and because of a few Baron changes that had gone through in between spring and summer, you saw games close out a lot faster at the very beginning of the split. Mm-hmm. So Clutch traditionally had an okay early game, a very strong middle objective game, and then the late game, if they got too far, they faltered. Yeah. With the beginning of summer, you had an early game, and then it immediately went to late game with the Baron dance. And that's really, there was no mid game for Clutch to take advantage of. So that's really, I think, the root of most of their problems this summer has been the lack of game length and the lack of a mid game to really make their fights count. You've seen that again this past weekend. They almost lost entirely when Golden Guardians got 3 kills to 1 at the 2-minute mark.
Yeah.
But then they fought their way out of it and came back in the mid game, and then they had so much advantage with solo in the top lane that their mid game transitioned into a great late game. So it's definitely coming back towards a meta where Clutch can succeed, I think. It gives me a lot of hope for them making a run through the gauntlet towards Worlds, but oh man, this has legitimately been the year with the most change for League of Legends, and that's with all the champions that have come out in the past years and all the changes to champions that have come out. They've been pretty much held to the mid-season and the preseason, with mid-season just being a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
And this year it's just been, we're changing everything whenever we want. So it's been hard to keep up with from a playing standpoint. I can't imagine what the pros are going through.
Yes, and I thank you for bringing it full circle, because that's exactly what I wanted to touch on, is how the meta affected preparations for certain teams, because certain teams have a type of style, and Clutch is one that really benefited from the early 8.1 throughout the spring, and teams that traditionally likes to play fast was benefited by 8.11 on, but now we're coming back a little. We also see this, it's not just affecting Clutch, because in the European side we have Splice and H2K, who are traditionally similar in the way that they approach it, at least in my observation. So
certainly,
before we head into the European counterpart, just for your predictions and your sense of what they look like, let me ask you about the gauntlet a little bit. Can you explain to us what the chances are for Clutch in the gauntlets and their journey towards Worlds?
For sure. So the 3 ways to qualify for Worlds from North America are to, first, you win the summer split. That's an automatic qualification. The second way is to have the most championship points based on your placement in the playoffs of spring and the playoffs of summer. So right now, Team Liquid is sitting with the most championship points since they won spring. So when I was mentioning earlier, I think they're going to move on because it's very easy for them with the most points already to hit second or third and probably have enough points to automatically qualify. Everybody else who has championship points, I believe it's the 4 teams with the most championship points, play in a gauntlet. So the 2 teams that qualify with the lowest championship points play each other in a best of 5. The team that wins that plays the team with the second most points in a best of 5, and then the team who wins that best of 5 moves on to the person who almost had enough points to auto qualify to Worlds, and then that's a best of 5 as well. So it really is a gauntlet run, and historically Cloud9 has been king of the gauntlet. They have never lost a gauntlet run. So that's the basics. For Clutch's chances, they really need FlyQuest or Optic to drop out of the playoffs in 5th or 6th place, because right now Clutch is sitting with 30 championship points with their 4th place finish from spring. They won't get any for summers because they're not in playoffs, but the summer 5th and 6th place teams will only get 20 points, which would be behind Clutch. So if TSM manages to go in, they have 10 points from spring. By making it to playoffs, they're guaranteed 20 points in summer. And that's where Clutch's chances start to get a little bit odd. And it starts to kind of fall out of their favor. But as of right now, they are very much alive for a miracle run from the very bottom of the gauntlet all the way to the top and onto Worlds.
Yes, and we're hoping that this meta change will bring back some comfort in their playstyle and definitely give them a chance. It would be great to see these newer teams or newer organizations go into Worlds, and it's happening all over the world. I don't know how much you pay attention to other regions, but we are seeing the traditional teams in LMS may not make it, aside from Flash Wolves, who is guaranteed. SKT is in danger of missing Worlds this year. They are part in their gauntlet in LCK. LPL Team WE, I don't like their chances right now. So a lot of different things are happening around the world, and it's exciting to see new people, new players make it there, and because Worlds is such an exciting event.
Absolutely. I was watching, well, I didn't watch it live, but I watched the coverage of the King Zone versus Afrika game earlier today,
Yeah.
and seeing Afrika upset King Zone, allowing KT to finally make Worlds.
Yes.
That's I gotta admit, I always read about KT Rolster. I haven't watched many of their games, but I am excited to see what they're capable of for a team that's been so historically troubled and has missed Worlds so many times.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of the Twitter personalities out there that I interact with or that I love to see their timeline, they are all KT fans. I didn't realize how big of a reach they have, but it's got to be exciting for them to finally make it. And hopefully it'll be an exciting year. Well, no, I know it for sure it'll be an exciting year. So stepping a little bit away from North America to Europe, what is your sense, and we can go through this quickly, what is your sense of how the teams are doing, which are your favorites, and how do you think it'll play out for them, which teams will make it to Worlds?
I'm super biased about this. The very first team that I saw play ever was Fnatic, and they, of course, the first time I watched them, they were losing to Alliance in the finals. But Fnatic has been the team that I've rooted for since I started watching competitive League of Legends. So I definitely think they're gonna win the split. They're gonna make it to Worlds. Just get that out of the way. But I definitely see a lot of strength in Schalke, Misfits, and G2. I really couldn't tell you which two out of those three is going to be making it to Worlds. I'd love to see Misfits back again, although I do not like Senkux. He's a lot like Mickey in that he does very well with assassins or unconventional mid laners, but when you go back to those traditional mid lane mages, he struggles so much. And that's why you saw Misfits missing playoffs in spring, really. Was a lot of his inability to cope with better mage players. I think G2 has got a really good shot at making it to Worlds. I love seeing the Fnatic G2 rivalry unfold, and I'm glad that Fnatic's finally winning. But G2 has also done pretty well for themselves this year, in spite of losing Sven and Mickey and both their jungle and top laner. I'm blanking on their names, and I'm terribly sorry.
No, it's all right.
But with their whole new roster, I'm glad to see that they're still competitive at the very least, because I did have some questions about that at the beginning of the year. Schalke, I have trouble reading. I want to say it's the year of the duck, along with the Fischio, but I'm not convinced quite yet. They're one of those teams that always seems to have just a little bit more struggle than I think they should, for as much hype as they're getting. So again, it's really hard for me to tell between those three teams which two are going to make it to Worlds along with Fnatic. But they're definitely the teams that I'm watching the most. I like Vitality because I'm a big fan of Yamato Cannon. Really? His coaching style, he's a very charismatic person, and I think he's one of those people that empowers his players to make their own decisions, although he definitely comes in with a plan against the enemy team. So I like Vitality. I like watching Vitality, but I'm not sure they're quite ready for the world stage. And Splice is... They might be in 6th place right now. They may be locked for playoffs, but I have very little confidence in them in spite of the meta coming back around. I think they're one of the teams that thrived with other teams failing in spring. Yes. When you saw both Schalke struggle, Misfits struggle, Unicorns of Love, they've been struggling for a while now.
Yeah.
But when you saw some of these other, I feel like, stronger rosters, more talented rosters struggling, that's when you saw Splice get a lot of success this year. So I don't have too much confidence in them making a big run for it.
Excellent. Those are some very good breakdown. And the European side, it's exciting. If you are just the North American fans, you watch which rivals, you've seen what they are able to achieve. And so I'm excited too. I'm also partial to Fanatics, believe it or not. I'm a big fan of Reckless. I like his maturity really impresses me, the way he speaks on, I think, podcasts, on different interviews, and it's just easy to root for him and his team, and just hoping that he'll make it, because I know it really means a lot to him. for him to get far. He is someone who um, took himself to Korean boot camp, even though the team were all recovering, and it's just easy to root for a guy like him.
Yeah, no, his work ethic has been absolutely insane this year. Like I said, I've been watching Fnatic for 4 years now. Back when he was on it, and then he left and came back. And I've been a fan of him too for a while, but I think this year he's really taken it to another level. He's a lot less vocal on social media now, which I kind of miss. But I know that that's because he's taking the game that much more seriously and honestly trying to compete with the all-stars of other regions. Of course, he's got a great relationship with Doublelift in spite of them being North America versus Europe rivals. But I mean, he really looks up to Uzi and Prey and Deft. He had a great relationship with Deft when they were boot camping in Korea a few years ago for Worlds. So I can really see all of that past experience culminating with a great work ethic. And yeah, he's the hero I root for as an AD carry. So
Yes. Awesome. Well, Zachery, thank you so much for joining me. Your knowledge, your wisdom is very helpful for myself, for our viewers. So before I let you go, why don't you tell people where they can find you, where they can find your work, what you have upcoming, and just have a shameless plug.
Sure. I am at ZLindsey01. That's ZLINDSEY01 on Twitter. You can also find our podcast Twitter. That's at League_Leaders and then the number 1 at the end. And that's where we post pretty much all of our podcasts. You'll also find our podcast posted on the Clutch Gaming subreddit as well. And please follow. We only have it on SoundCloud for the moment, although we are working to expand for other platforms as well. And also keep an eye on my Twitter. A bit more of a shameless plug, but I'm starting a Dungeons and Dragons podcast with some friends of mine.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to have that published relatively soon. So keep an eye out for that as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and hope to see you more around on Twitter. And if not, just hit me up with any questions you might have, guys. If you have questions about NA, if you have questions about Clutch, even I think you are well versed with the Academy team as well. People have questions about those. Go find at ZLindsey01. I'll post it on the show description. And if you guys have any comments, questions about myself and the show, don't hesitate to contact me on Twitter, on the YouTube comment section, or on Instagram. Thank you so much for joining me, Zach, and hope we'll have an amazing weekend watching the final regular season game.
My pleasure, man. It should be really exciting.
All right, thank you.